I had a sudden realization, like in those cartoons when a light bulb appears above a character's head. It turns out that my third child wasn't actually biologically mine. I was on the phone with a representative from genealogygurus.com, trying to figure out why my daughter's DNA test hadn't been processed after 10 weeks. I had given it to her as an extra Christmas gift, and provided the representative with the necessary numbers to track it down. After waiting for about 5 minutes, he got back on the line and assured me that the test had been processed. However, he explained that this was a confidentiality matter, so he couldn't give me any additional information. I asked, if you processed it, why doesn't it show up on my DNA results? I was quite excited when I asked this. The representative replied somewhat irritably, "Sir, there are several reasons why your daughter may not appear in your DNA matches, but I can't discuss this specific test with you." That's when it hit me, like a light bulb going off in my head. The number one reason she doesn't show up in my matches is because she's not biologically related to me. I ended the call in a daze. I remember pressing the red end call button, and then breaking down in tears. I woke up a few minutes later, curled up on the couch in the family room. I still had 15 minutes left before my lunch break, so I decided to call my daughter, who was probably on her lunch break as well, since we both worked in the same time zone. I knew she usually enjoyed lunch while reading a book at her desk, so I wasn't concerned about bothering her. She picked up the phone after the first ring, and greeted me with a somewhat weary tone. "Hi, Daddy. How are you?" I responded, "Sweetheart, you know I love and trust you completely, but I found out about the DNA test. I called the genealogy company and they told me it was processed about 2 weeks ago." There was a moment of silence, and I could hear her taking a deep breath on the other end of the line. "I know, Dad. We need to talk, but I can't do it here and now. Call me tonight. And please make sure Mom isn't in the room when you do." I felt like a blur as I drove back to the office, and I have to admit that I didn't have a very productive afternoon at the engineering firm where I work. My mind was in turmoil with countless thoughts and questions, especially the unsettling idea that my beloved daughter might not really be my own. Being naturally analytical, I realized I needed to sort things out and deal with each issue methodically. After all, I held the position of VP of engineering for a reason, and I understood that treating personal problems as if they were project challenges was the way to go. The old man, Dwayne, had instilled this approach in me when he hired me straight out of university to work for his then burgeoning company. With Dwayne as our leader and me right by his side, his company grew into an industry powerhouse, and we both enjoyed success. I had a great income, excellent benefits, and I collaborated with smart, witty colleagues. Plus, when I got home each evening, I was greeted by my beautiful wife and 3 amazing children. As the years went by, the kids grew up, moved out, and started their own families. At first, the house felt a bit empty, but my wife and I found ways to keep ourselves busy, and I believe that the quiet moments brought us closer together as a couple. However, as I thought back on the events of the past month, a few strange incidents stood out in my mind. One of them was a phone call Marissa made to my wife about 2 weeks ago. It happened on a Tuesday night while we were watching TV in the family room. Tracy's phone rang, and she saw that it was Marissa calling. She answered the call, and they talked for about 5 minutes. I noticed tears welling up in Tracy's eyes. When she hung up, I asked if everything was okay. She explained that Marissa's cat was having some health issues. Tracy tried to downplay it, but I could sense that something was bothering her. It struck me as odd how deeply she seemed to be affected by Marissa's cat's problems. Little did I know, that phone call might have been the moment when Marissa discovered the truth. Tracy had no idea about the DNA test I had secretly sent to Marissa. I didn't think it was a big deal, so I never mentioned it to her. Marissa was the only one of our kids who showed any interest in genealogy, so I thought she would be excited about taking the test. I had been researching our family history for years, and I loved the idea of DNA testing. I assumed Marissa would be eager to do it. Clearly, I was wrong. When I got home, I made a conscious effort to treat Tracy the same way as always, even though I was feeling a whirlwind of emotions inside. I kept repeating myself, work on one problem at a time, one problem at a time. I met Tracy during my second year of college. We didn't really get to know each other until my last year, but from that point on, it felt like we were inseparable. We got married a year after graduating, and I can honestly say it was the best decision I ever made. Even now, At 54 years old, she still radiates beauty. And despite having 3 kids, she keeps herself fit and looks like she's in her 30s. She's full of fun and humor, and until today, I was excited about spending the rest of my life with her. Around 8 o'clock, I told Tracy that I needed to make a call to an old colleague about a project we were working on together. I excused myself from the room and pretended to make the call. In reality, I put on my jacket and went out to the porch swing, where I could have a private conversation without worrying about Tracy overhearing. That's when I dialed Marissa's number. Marissa answered on the very first ring, and I could hear the distress in her voice. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know I should have told you earlier, but Mom asked me to keep quiet until she had a chance to talk to you," Marissa whispered before I could even say hello. "Hey, I'm not angry with you," I replied, trying to comfort her. "Take a deep breath. I'm not blaming you. You're just as much a victim in this mess as I am." I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end, and I knew how much this was tearing her apart. "I want you to understand that this changes nothing between us. I'm still your dad, and you'll always be my pumpkin. I've poured all my love into you kids all these years, and I'm not about to stop now, unless that's what you want." At this point, she broke down completely, and her sobs made it hard to understand her over the phone. "I love you, Daddy. I don't need anyone else but you." I cautiously told my daughter that I didn't want to put her in a tough spot, but she was my best source for DNA information. I assured her that we wouldn't talk about other matters so she wouldn't get caught in the middle. I was shocked when she confirmed that Amanda, Uncle George, and Aunt Jenny's daughter, was the one I was looking for. She had worked at Gooey Howe, and eventually became the office manager. George and Jenny had become such close friends with us that our children still called them Uncle and Auntie, and their kids called me, and Tracy the same. Sometimes, when I was away on business trips, Tracy and the kids would spend time at George and Jenny's lake house. It never raised any suspicions in my mind, and the kids even talked about Aunt Jenny taking them places without me or Tracy. I must have missed some important details. Lost in my thoughts, I was brought back to reality when Marissa called out to me. I apologized to my daughter, explaining that I got lost in thought, and thanked her for her help. I asked her to say hi to Drew, her husband, for me. Marissa then asked me what I was planning to do. I admitted that I wasn't entirely sure. She advised me not to do anything incredibly stupid, saying a little foolishness was okay, but warned me against doing anything that might get me arrested. Until that moment, I hadn't entertained thoughts of harming Tracy, but I promised Marissa that I wouldn't get myself arrested. So I guess that ruled out any thoughts of violence. I never break promises to my kids, ever. My top priority was to calm Marissa down about our relationship, and then I needed to find out who Tracy's partner in crime was. The third task on my list was to start the process of getting a divorce. But I had to find a new lawyer, because my current one worked at the same firm as Tracy, which wouldn't work. After meeting with a lawyer and getting everything organized, I would then have to deal with soon-to-be ex-Mrs. Clark Walters. The house felt cold and empty. When Tracy and I were together, she would talk non-stop, probably because she was nervous. She tried hard to keep me happy, maybe thinking it would soften the blow when I eventually found out the truth. It's hard to say for sure, but there was definitely a growing distance between us, and she wasn't making any effort to bridge it. About a week later, I met with one lawyer. As soon as he found out that my wife was the office manager at Gooey Howe, he looked worried. So I moved on to the next lawyer on my list, a young woman in her 20s who simply smiled when I mentioned Tracy's position at Gooey Howe. This was the kind of lawyer I needed, someone who wouldn't be intimidated if one of the high-profile Gooey attorneys represented my wife. I shared what little I knew about the cheating situation, starting with the fact that my youngest child wasn't biologically mine, but was actually George Anderson's child. Court of Appeals George Anderson, my attorney, Marie Robinette, asked. "Yes," I replied, watching her closely to see if I should find another lawyer. "It must be quite a story," she remarked, and we discussed the financial aspects. However, I told her that I didn't want to ruin Tracy financially, despite feeling wronged. Marie then asked about pursuing legal action against the judge involved, but I firmly stated that the judge was my concern, and I would handle it my way. Marie understood and suggested that if my spouse didn't contest, the issue could be resolved in 6 months, but if she did, it might take more than a year. I told her that I hadn't set any deadlines yet, so she should take her time and do it right. With the third task completed, it was time to move on to the fourth, the confrontation. I waited another week just to see if Tracy's conscience would get the best of her during that time. Saturday night was our usual date night, followed by watching a movie and sharing an intimate moment. However, we hadn't been on a date in 2 weeks, and it had been just as long since we had been intimate. After finding out about Marissa's affair, I couldn't bring myself to go through with it. Tracy didn't question it, which was another sign that she knew I was aware, but she was skilled at putting on a facade. However, that was about to change. I decided to take her to a fancy French restaurant, where we enjoyed a bottle of wine and indulged in some delicious desserts. She seemed happier than she had in weeks. When we got back home, I carefully helped her take off her coat and guided her to the kitchen table. I pulled out a chair for her and said those famous words, "We need to talk." Tracy gave me a half smile as I poured myself a drink and offered her one too, but she politely declined. I placed my drink on the table and looked her in the eyes, giving her the floor to speak. Tracy started by reminding me that her affair with George happened a long time ago, about 20 years ago. She asked if we could consider it a mistake from the past and move on. I was relieved that she didn't argue about the accuracy of the DNA test, but her attempt to brush it off as ancient history felt dismissive. I wanted more details, so I asked about the timeline and how often she was involved with George. I also wanted to know if our first 2 children, Barry and Kathy, were his. Tracy clarified that Barry and Kathy were indeed mine, and her involvement with George started about a year after Kathy was born and lasted for around 3 years. She explained that it ended when George left his job to become a judge, making sure his background check was clean. After their breakup, they only had a few encounters at the lake house when Jenny took the kids out, with Jenny being unaware of the truth at first but eventually finding out. Tracy mentioned a meeting where she and George promised Jenny that there would be no more intimacy. Feeling frustrated, I asked Tracy why she never tried to have an honest conversation with me. I wondered if I was just a backup plan for her. She replied, wiping her hands on her sleeves, that she knew she could never tell me because I would have filed for divorce right away. She claimed that she loved me then, and still does. I couldn't help but point out that it seemed like she loved George more, considering she started and stopped with him at his command, while I was just a backup option. Tracy desperately protested, insisting that she loved me with all her heart. But I accused her of loving George with all her heart, sacrificing our relationship for his career dreams, while knowing I was there as a fallback. I mentioned how much I idolized her and relied on our family to cope with his absence. Tracy's gaze fell to her knees, confirming this painful truth. Regarding Marissa, Tracy confessed that during her affair with George, she didn't think about the consequences until the DNA test revealed the truth. She assumed that since both she and George had similar physical features, no one would suspect Marissa's paternity. She thought I wouldn't question it, especially since Marissa resembled her. She didn't know for sure until the DNA test. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and questioned if she was blaming me. Tracy explained that she and George had discussed the possibility of Marissa's paternity, but she reassured him not to worry because Marissa looked like me. She mentioned that George might not have known either, but probably knows by now. She hadn't heard from him since Marissa and Drew's wedding 2 years ago. Tracy emphasized that regardless of who knew what, Marissa was still hers. She insisted that she was listed on the birth certificate, raised her, loved her, and considered her her own. She sternly warned George not to even think about claiming otherwise and told me to make that clear if he contacted me. I told her that I intended to have the other 2 children undergo DNA testing as soon as possible because I needed peace of mind. Tracy pleaded with me, insisting that I already knew they were mine, and questioned why I couldn't trust her. My newfound distrust was evident in my response, which surprised Tracy. She was also worried about me revealing her infidelity to our other 2 children, not wanting to appear unfaithful in front of them. Changing the subject, I asked for more details about her affair, wanting to know how often it happened and where else they met. Tracy started to explain that her relationship with George wasn't planned. It developed from spending time together at work and becoming friends, and then it turned into something more. She described George as kind, considerate, witty, funny, and passionate, and mentioned that they had a deep connection. Because they both loved their spouses, they kept their meetings discreet, usually out of town, and never at either of our houses because that would have been wrong. Tracy whispered to me that they hadn't been intimate since their affair ended. When I asked if Jenny knew about all of this and had forgiven them, Tracy confirmed that she had told me before. I whispered, uncertainly, that I didn't think I could go back to how things were. Tracy tried to reassure me, acknowledging that what they did was wrong, but emphasizing that it had been over for 20 years, and that I hadn't had to go through it while it was happening. She pleaded for us to go back to our lives from a few weeks ago, where we were a loving husband and wife, insisting that nothing had to change. But I firmly told Tracy that things had already changed. I shared that I had spent the past few weeks wondering what I had done wrong for her to fall in love with another man. I questioned whether I could ever fully trust her again, let alone enough to stay married. I expressed with heavy emotion that I had given her my heart completely, and yet she treated it as something to be taken out, only when it suited her. I stressed that our marriage was supposed to be based on unwavering love, not convenience. Tracy began to cry, but this time, I didn't console her. I left her alone at the kitchen table and retreated to the family room, feeling hurt and betrayed. That night, we shared the same bed, but there was no cuddling. I moved away from her as much as I could on the bed and didn't let her snuggle up to me. Her face showed surprise and pain, but I didn't really care. The next morning, as we had breakfast, I brought up the topic of divorce. Tracy practically yelled at me, arguing that the affair happened over 20 years ago, and that I didn't even know about it. She urged me to let go of the past and move forward. In response, I shouted back, emphasizing that a mistake remains a mistake regardless of how long ago it occurred. I expressed my feelings of betrayal, highlighting how she deceived me, lied to me, and cheated on me, breaking my trust. I pointed out that these were not temporary problems. Unable to continue the conversation, I got up from the table, leaving half my plate of food behind, and went outside to mow the lawn. That was the last conversation I had with Tracy until Wednesday afternoon, when she told me that Jenny Anderson would be joining us next weekend. I wasn't thrilled, but Jenny was an old and dear friend who had gone through the same cheating ordeal as I had, so I thought it was worth having a chat with her. On Friday night at 6 o'clock, Jenny showed up, having traveled 2 hours from her house. Surprisingly, she didn't bring George with her. During dinner, our conversation remained light and friendly, and afterward, we moved to the family room with glasses of wine, presumably to talk about the main issue. Jenny began discussing the affair as if it were a distant historical topic, speaking calmly and without much emotion. However, as she continued, her emotions intensified, and tears welled up in both hers and Tracy's eyes. Jenny shared that when George told her about the affair, she had assumed it had ended years ago, and he had assured her it wouldn't happen again. She admitted that she was devastated at first, but after thinking about it, she realized that since it was over before she even knew about it, she wasn't hurt too badly. I could understand why Jenny felt that way. George has a captivating personality after all. Although I only found out about Marissa a few weeks ago, like everyone else, I can see where Jenny is coming from. I'm genuinely sorry about that, Clark. Jenny didn't mention the times Tracy and George met after their initial affair, especially at the Andersons' lake house. I wondered if they had told her about those occasions, but I didn't bother to ask. It did make me wonder, though, if George must be a skilled lawyer, because Jenny seemed to be almost apologizing for his affair instead of being upset with him. Unfortunately for Tracy, I'm not as forgiving as Jenny, and I'm not as impressed by her way with words. So I wasn't inclined to let Tracy and George off the hook, even though their romance had lasted for 2 decades. Jenny continued, saying that she often thinks about what her life would be like if she left George, and how it would affect her and the girls. They say you should always consider whether your life would be better or worse without your spouse. In my case, I think it would be worse. Thank you for sharing your perspective with me, Jenny. It's definitely something to think about, and I'll need to carefully consider it. There are several factors at play, including the fact that, unlike you, I wasn't informed about the affair. I stumbled upon it by accident. Tracy knew it was wrong when she was involved with George, and expected my reaction. She believed it would be better for everyone if I never found out and just lived in ignorance. That would have been the case if it weren't for the DNA test. Now, 20 years later, I've discovered that the love of my life had an intimate relationship with another man before coming back to me. During Jenny's story, Tracy remained silent, just listening, as Jenny shared her side. Tracy couldn't have known that I noticed her glances in my direction, so I sat casually while Jenny spoke, just to mildly annoy Tracy. My response to Jenny's story wasn't what Tracy had hoped for, and neither was Jenny's. They exchanged sad looks, realizing that I wasn't reacting the way they expected. I shook my head, went to the kitchen, poured myself another glass of wine, returned to the family room, and turned on the big screen. It was a clear sign that our conversation for the day was over. The ladies got the hint and moved to the living room, where I could faintly hear them chatting. After finishing whatever I was watching, I turned off the TV, peeked into the living room to say goodnight, and headed upstairs to our bedroom. On Saturday, Jenny approached me in the family room, insisting that we needed to have a serious conversation. Unsure of where Tracy was, I agreed and followed Jenny to the formal living room, where we found seats in a cozy corner. Jenny began by acknowledging the pain I was feeling, but she argued that not forgiving Tracy and divorcing her would be a huge mistake for both of us. She stressed that our love for each other should be the most important thing, and that we should leave the past behind. Jenny pointed out how tragic it would be for us to spend the rest of our lives apart because of something that happened 20 years ago. She mentioned that if she could forgive George, then I could surely forgive Tracy too. I responded honestly to Jenny, admitting that I wasn't sure if I could forgive Tracy. I reminded her that, unlike her situation where she was told about the affair, Tracy never confessed to me. I argued that Tracy knew it was wrong, and that I wouldn't have forgiven her back then, so I questioned why I should forgive her now. I emphasized the weight of her deception. Not only did she cheat on me for a few years, but she also continued to deceive me for 2 more decades. I expressed my struggle with the idea of forgiving Tracy, and questioned how I could ever trust her again. Frustrated, I shook my head, stood up, and left the room, passing Tracy in the hallway. She could tell from my expression that I wasn't budging an inch. Dinner that Saturday night was unusually quiet. The women tried to make small talk, but I wasn't interested. I barely said a word throughout the meal. After a quick thank you, I grabbed my jacket and left, informing them that I'd be at Malone's, my favorite spot for a quiet drink. At Malone's, I felt down and chose a table instead of my usual spot at the bar. The owner, who was like a sister to me, encouraged me to open up. I shared with her that my wife Tracy had cheated, and that our youngest child might not be mine. She was outraged and supported me, offering her honest perspective. I appreciated her honesty. She questioned whether Tracy had truly apologized for the affair, or if she was just sorry for getting caught. It made me realize that Tracy hadn't really apologized. The bar owner offered me free drinks and arranged for a cab, taking my keys for safety. The cab dropped me off at home around 2 in the morning. Tracy greeted me at the door and helped me up to our bedroom. I collapsed into bed fully clothed, and Tracy kindly removed my shoes and socks. And that's how I slept. Late on Wednesday night, my son called me at the office. He wanted to talk to me about Tracy's situation. Although he didn't say it directly, it seemed like Tracy had involved the kids to convince me not to get a divorce. My son and I usually agreed on most things, but from our conversation, it was clear that Tracy had put in a lot of effort, and it had worked, as he sympathized with her side of the divorce dilemma. I had to firmly explain to him. I told him that what she did at first could be seen as a mistake, but when it continued for months, it became a choice. I asked him how he would feel if his wife Linda was cheating on him. Even though the affair ended years ago, the deceit and disrespect didn't. I felt that Barry should have stayed out of our parents' issues. He was taking sides and getting involved in something he shouldn't. I was frustrated and felt betrayed after looking up to my wife, only to find out she had kept this secret. If it wasn't for a certain accident, I would still be in the dark. It felt like she used me as a backup plan. As Barry tried to argue that I was overreacting, I hung up, feeling like the conversation wasn't going anywhere. When I got home around 6 in the evening, Tracy was already busy cooking a delicious meal. She didn't look happy when I mentioned that I wasn't hungry. I poured myself a glass of Jack, turned on the TV, and settled into my favorite chair. She came in and asked what was wrong. It was the same old stuff, just a different day. My wife cheated on me for 4 years, had a child with another man, and now my kids are making me out to be the bad guy. I asked her to do me a favor and call Kathy tonight, telling her not to call me tomorrow unless she wants to be hung up on like Barry. Tracy lowered her eyes. After 31 years, you'd think she would know not to provoke me on her behalf. What makes you think the divorce won't happen? I said, raising my voice. Not only did you cheat on me for 4 years and have a child with another man, but you also replaced me in your heart with him. You can sit here and tell me that you weren't in love with him, and that if he had asked you to divorce me and marry him, you wouldn't have done it. The truth is, you may love me, but you're not in love with me. You're in love with him. I'm just a reliable backup because you've always known that my heart belongs to you, and I would do anything to keep you as mine. You cheated on me, lied to me, disrespected me, and now you have the audacity to try to turn our children against me. That was the final straw for me, Tracy. But I won't seek revenge against you, especially not towards Jenny, and I won't ruin George's promising career as a respected judge. Instead, I'm going to file for a divorce based on irreconcilable differences. We can each keep our retirement accounts and split everything else, including the house, right down the middle. Tracy's tears flowed down her cheeks as she stood up from her chair. I couldn't resist adding one more hurtful comment. You never mentioned regretting your affair, probably because you don't regret it at all. The only thing you regret is that I found out, isn't it? The rest of the night was spent alone with a bottle of Jack Daniels. The next day, I contacted my lawyer and asked her to prepare the divorce papers as quickly as possible. She said I could review them on Tuesday, and they would be ready for Wednesday. Tracy could be served on Thursday, but I insisted that the process server come to my house on Friday night. I wanted to be there when she received the papers. Then, I made a call to Judge George Anderson's office and left a message for him to call me back regarding an important matter. He understood what I meant, but preferred to handle it outside of his office. I agreed, and told him I would be at his house the following Saturday, at 10 a.m. He didn't know yet that Tracy would be served the night before, but I was sure he would find out by the time I made the 2-hour drive to his fancy house. During dinner at Malone's on Saturday night, Tracy mentioned that Jenny had told her about my upcoming meeting with George the following Saturday. Tracy asked if she should come with me. I explained that this wasn't just a casual conversation. George and I had serious matters to discuss, and her presence wasn't necessary. I reminded her that he was an appellate court judge with a great reputation, possibly even in line for a Supreme Court position. Any confrontational behavior could have legal consequences. Plus, she had promised not to do anything that would harm his career. Tracy responded with a hint of jealousy, but I reassured her that I intended to keep my promise and not jeopardize George's future. After confiding in a senior colleague at work about my situation, I took a few personal hours to meet with my lawyer and review the divorce papers. I gave her the go-ahead. As I was about to leave, she asked if I had any plans regarding Judge George. Confused, I asked why she was concerned. She replied, "Because I still handle some criminal cases, and I thought you might need a good lawyer. You engineers may not get too emotional about many things, but your methodical approach can be intimidating." She handed me her business card, and I left her office. The next 3 days flew by in a blur. We had a big project at work that kept me busy and distracted from my personal problems. Even the older gentleman in the office noticed how focused I was despite everything going on in my life. I told him that it was a relief to have something going smoothly for once. But on Friday evening, before leaving the office, I opened up to him about Tracy being served with a lawsuit and my upcoming meeting with George. I warned him that things could go wrong, and I might end up in jail by Monday. He assured me that he would support me, and even offered to provide bail money if needed. We shook hands and went our separate ways. When I got home, I was greeted by the delicious smell of another one of Tracy's amazing meals. Lately, she had been going out of her way to show off her cooking skills, and I had to admit, she was a fantastic cook. Despite the tension that had been present during our meals for the past few weeks, I made sure to express my gratitude for the wonderful dinner. I wasn't about to be ungrateful. After dinner, as we were about to settle in the family room to watch some TV, the doorbell rang. It was almost 7 o'clock, and I had a feeling it wasn't for me, so I stayed where I was. Tracy, on the other hand, gave me a quick glance and went to answer the door. She opened it to find a well-dressed young man, who asked if she was Tracy Walters. Confirming her identity, he handed her a manila envelope and said, "You have been served." Then he quickly walked away. Tracy stood frozen in place, but the slump in her shoulders and the tears welling up in her eyes said it all. I walked past her, closed the front door, and gently guided her to the kitchen table. She looked completely shaken, just as I had expected. We sat there in silence for what felt like forever, although only 5 minutes had passed. Finally, she muttered, "You jerk," and ran upstairs to our bedroom. I chose not to follow her. The hardest part was over now. For one of the rare times since we got married, I didn't sleep in the same bed as Tracy that night. Instead, I went to the guest bedroom we had set up, although it wouldn't be accurate to say that I slept. The woman I had once considered the love of my life, my soulmate, my everything, was still sharing a bed with me despite everything that had happened. I guess neither of us wanted to be the first to make a move, but in my mind, it was all over. The next morning, I woke up, took a shower, and got dressed quietly, being careful not to disturb Tracy or start any arguments. I didn't bother checking if Tracy was asleep. I just gathered my things and left. I wore my usual outfit, a nice shirt, jeans, and my special cowboy boots with metal tips that I got when I visited our son in Dallas. I left a bit earlier than necessary because I wanted to make sure I wasn't late for the meeting. If I arrived early, I could pass the time at a cafe, which is exactly what I did. I got to George and Jenny's house at exactly 10 o'clock and rang the doorbell. Jenny, who always looked lovely but seemed nervous, opened the door. All I could manage to say was, "I'm sorry it had to end like this," as she leaned in for a hug. She didn't say anything, but she did take my hand and led me into the room where George had his collection of memories and pictures displayed. George was sitting in his favorite chair, but when we walked in, he stood up and positioned himself in front of it. "Hey, Clark," he greeted me. "Hey, George." Jenny, looking worried, left the room. We stood about 6 feet apart, sizing each other up. There was a time when I considered George almost like an older brother. We were that close. George was 2 years older than me, about the same height, but he had gained some weight over the years, mostly in his round belly. We had shared our hopes and dreams, had countless adventures together, and gone fishing and hunting side by side. I used to be proud to call him my friend, and was equally proud of his successful career as a judge. But now, standing before me, his gaze no longer that of a friend but an enemy, I felt a surge of anger. "You've got my wife's heart, you jerk," I yelled at him. "You also get to keep your clean reputation, because I promised Tracy I wouldn't tell anyone about this. And I don't break promises to her. But you won't keep your dignity." With that, I took a big step forward with my left foot, planted my right foot, and delivered a powerful kick aimed straight for his groin. George reacted slower than I expected, and my metal-tipped boot hit its target accurately. I could feel his pain as I kicked, and then I heard him cry out in agony as he crumpled to the floor, holding his injured area and howling like a wounded animal. In that moment, all the anger and frustration boiled over. Jenny rushed into the room, seeing her husband in pain on the floor. She tried to comfort him, but his screams only grew louder. She looked at me with fear in her eyes. I reached for my cell phone and dialed 911. In a calm voice, I told them that there had been an accident at Judge George Anderson's house, and that we needed an ambulance. As I turned to leave, Jenny grabbed my arm. I prepared myself for a fight, but instead she had a strangely calm expression on her face. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you. We know what needs to be done." I hugged her back, left the house, got in my car, and drove home, feeling confident that the police wouldn't come after me. Jenny understood, and she would explain everything to her husband when he was able to think clearly. The drive home was a mix of relief and maybe a little sadness. After months of heartbreak, I finally felt free. It's funny how realizing Tracy's betrayal actually helped me let go of the pain and think clearly about what was best for me. It might not have been the right choice for everyone, but sometimes you have to prioritize your own well-being. That's what everyone else had done for the past 20 years. So why shouldn't I? Sure, a part of me would always love Tracy, but I wasn't going to dwell on this chapter any longer. It wasn't my fault, and it wasn't my choice. It was time to move forward. When I got home, I went to the basement, grabbed a couple of suitcases, and headed to our bedroom. Tracy followed me from the family room and asked, "Is that it then? Are you leaving?" I replied, "Yes, that's it. 31 years, and out the door. Tracy, it's a shame that you're so focused on yourself that you can't see how you deceived me and stole 24 years of my love through your lies. But I've moved past it, and I don't hate you. I don't even hate George, although he probably thinks I do now. I'll mend things with Barry and Kathy in the future. You should patch things up with Marissa as soon as you can. Those girls are missing out. Sign the papers, Tracy, and let's put this behind us, I continued. I'll have the rest of my things out of here in the next few days. We don't need to talk anymore. If you have anything to say to me. I left my lawyer's business card on the kitchen table. She stood there in shock, tears welling up, but no words came out. I quickly grabbed my suitcases and went back downstairs to hide them in the trunk of my car. Once I returned to the house, I packed up all my belongings and left. Just like that, after 31 years, it was the end. But here's the thing. I lied. Turns out George was able to save one of his testicles after all. It took a lot of surgery and months of pain, but they managed to save one. I found out about it from Marissa, who had been contacted by Jenny trying to reach me. Jenny didn't have my phone number, and the rest of the family didn't want to tell me anything. They haven't spoken to me in 8 months, but I've come to accept it. According to the official story, Judge George had an accident in his office, falling onto the corner of his fancy desk and ending up on the floor. The media downplayed it, calling it a domestic accident, and not mentioning the injury to his sensitive area. Surprisingly, he received a lot of sympathy from the public. I guess even this won't stop him from being considered for the Supreme Court. Tracy signed the divorce papers in just a week. And last week, the divorce was finalized. The house will be sold at an auction. Tracy hasn't tried to contact me since I left. And neither have Barry or Kathy. It looks like I won't be joining them for the family Christmas dinner, wherever they decide to have it. The old man is passing the company over to me next year as he retires. According to our agreement, I'll have to run the company for 7 years before I can retire comfortably with a nice payout. After that, he plans to sell the company, and I'll get a 10% cut of that deal too. I've started going out and dating again. After being married for what felt like forever, it'll take some time to remember how all of that works. Interestingly, news of my divorce spread quickly, and quite a few divorced friends reached out, showing interest. Even a couple of Tracy's divorced friends called, surprised that she let me go. I have to admit, it's been a nice boost to my confidence. I see a promising future ahead, filled with challenges both in my career and personal life. In my free time, I'm exploring new hobbies. One thing I've given up on is genealogy. I used to be into it, but it's not something I'm pursuing anymore.